Imagine this, one of the greatest civilizations in human history, pyramids touching the sky, pharaohs, worshipped as gods, armies marching under golden banners, and yet, behind all this power, someone else was really in control. Not the king you see in history books, not the queen whose beauty shaped legends, but hidden figures, silent minds, pulling every string without ever sitting on the throne. Because here's the truth, no one talks about power, is rarely where it appears to be. Ancient Egypt looked like a kingdom ruled by divine pharaohs. But if you look deeper, you'll start to notice something strange. Pharaohs changed, dynasties collapsed, invasions happened, but the system, the structure, the control never truly disappeared. So the real question is, who was behind it all? Let's go deeper. From the very beginning, Egyptian pharaohs were seen as gods on earth. They were not just rulers. They were believed to be the living connection between heaven and earth. But think about it, if a ruler is treated like a god, who actually controls what that god believes? This is where the first hidden power appears: the priests. The priesthood of Egypt wasn't just about religion, it was about control. They controlled temples, knowledge, rituals, and most importantly, they controlled the idea of truth. The average person in Egypt couldn't read, couldn't question, couldn't challenge anything. Everything they believed came from the temples, and the temples were controlled by priests. That means the priests didn't just serve the pharaoh, they shaped the pharaoh. They decided which gods were important, which rituals must be followed, and what the will of the gods actually was. And if the pharaoh ever stepped out of line, they had a simple solution. They could turn the entire population against him without lifting a single sword, because when people believe their king has lost divine approval, his power disappears overnight. Now imagine the level of control this gives. A king may wear the crown, but the priests controlled the meaning of that crown. And this wasn't just theory, history gives us real examples. There was a time when a pharaoh tried to break this system, a ruler who wanted to change everything. His name was Akhenaten. He did something unthinkable. He tried to replace all the traditional gods of Egypt with one single god, Aten. This wasn't just a religious change. It was a direct attack on the priesthood, because if people stopped worshiping the old gods, the priests would lose their power. And for a short time, it worked. Akhenaten moved the capital, erased old traditions, and tried to build a new Egypt under his vision. But here's where things get interesting. The moment he died, everything he built vanished. His temples were destroyed, his name was erased from history, and Egypt went back to its old system like nothing ever happened. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when powerful people behind the scenes decide something must be erased. The priests didn't just survive, they proved something very important. They were stronger than the pharaoh. But the priests were not the only hidden force. There was another group, less visible, but just as powerful. The royal advisors and scribes. These were the people who wrote laws, recorded history, managed administration, and handled communication across the empire. Think about that for a second. If you control what gets written, you control what people believe happened. If you control records, you control memory itself. And in a civilization like Egypt, where everything depended on written records, scribes were not just workers, they were gatekeepers of reality. They could make a weak ruler look powerful, or make a powerful ruler disappear from history. They could rewrite victories, hide failures, and shape the legacy of entire dynasties. Now combine this with the priesthood, and you start to see the full picture. Religion controls belief. Writing controls memory. Together they control everything. But there's more, because power also comes from money, and Egypt had its own version of economic controllers. Temples were not just religious centers, they were economic giants. They owned land, collected taxes, stored grain, and controlled massive resources. In some periods, temples were richer than the pharaoh himself. And when you control resources, you control survival. If crops failed, people turned to temples. If famine came, temples decided who lived and who starved. That kind of power doesn't need a crown. It creates kings and destroys them. Now let's push this even further. Egypt didn't exist in isolation. It traded with other civilizations, formed alliances, and faced external threats. And this opened the door for another hidden influence, foreign powers. At different points in history, Egypt was influenced, manipulated, and even quietly controlled by outsiders. The Hyksos, for example, didn't just invade, they integrated into Egyptian systems. Later, the Persians, and then the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and eventually the Romans all took control. But here's the twist. Even when foreign rulers took over, they didn't destroy the system, they used it. They kept the priests, used the scribes, and maintained the structure, because they understood something critical. The real power of Egypt was not just in armies or kings, it was in the system of control built over centuries. And whoever controlled that system controlled Egypt. Even Cleopatra, one of the most famous rulers in history, is often seen as a powerful queen who controlled everything. But the reality is more complex. She was incredibly intelligent, politically skilled, and strategic. But she still had to work within the same system. She formed alliances with powerful Roman leaders, influenced politics, and used every tool available to maintain power. But in the end, even she couldn't escape the larger forces at play, because Egypt eventually became a province of Rome. Which brings us to a deeper truth. Power is never just one person, it's layers. Visible rulers and invisible controllers. Pharaohs were the face, priests were the voice of the gods, scribes were the keepers of truth, temples were the centers of wealth, advisors were the strategists, and sometimes foreign powers were the ones pulling the strings from afar. Now think about this. If you lived in ancient Egypt, you would see the pharaoh as everything. A god, a king, an absolute ruler. But behind that image, there was a network, a system, a machine designed to maintain control, no matter who sat on the throne. And that's why Egypt lasted for thousands of years. Not because of one great ruler, but because of a structure that could survive any ruler. Even a weak king could appear powerful as long as the system supported him. And even a strong king could fall if the system turned against him. So when you ask who secretly controlled Egypt, the answer is not simple. It wasn't one person. It was a hidden alliance of power, religion, knowledge, and wealth. A system so strong that even history itself was shaped to hide it. And maybe the most fascinating part of all this is, we only know what they allowed to be remembered. Everything else is lost, erased, or buried beneath the sands of time. So the next time you think about ancient Egypt, don't just imagine pyramids and pharaohs. Imagine the shadows behind them. Because in those shadows, that's where the real power lived. What if everything you've heard so far is only the surface? Because the deeper you go into ancient Egypt, the more unsettling the truth becomes. The system we talked about, priests, scribes, temples, that wasn't just power. It was control perfected over centuries. And here's where things take a darker turn. Because controlling a kingdom is one thing, but controlling what people think, fear, and believe, that's a completely different level. And Egypt mastered it. Think about this. Why were the pyramids really built? You've probably heard they were tombs for pharaohs, symbols of power, monuments of legacy. But look closer. These structures were not just physical, they were psychological. Massive, impossible, overwhelming. They weren't just built to honor kings. They were built to send a message. You are small, the system is eternal. When ordinary people saw these giant structures, they didn't just see architecture, they felt fear, awe, and submission. That's not accidental. That's control through perception. And guess who reinforced that perception? The priests. They didn't just perform rituals, they created fear of the unknown. Life after death, judgment, punishment, divine consequences. They made people believe that obedience wasn't just required in this life, but in the next one too. Now think about the level of control that creates. You're not just controlling actions. You're controlling souls. And once people believe that, they stop questioning everything. But here's where it gets even more intense. Because not everyone inside Egypt accepted this system quietly. There were moments, rare moments, when someone tried to break free. We already talked about Akhenaten, the ruler who challenged the entire religious structure. But what most people don't realize is, he didn't just fail, he was erased. His statues destroyed, his name removed, his existence almost wiped out. That's not just political revenge. That's something much bigger. That's a system protecting itself. Because if one person successfully breaks the illusion, the entire structure collapses. So the system doesn't just fight back, it deletes you. Now ask yourself, how many others tried, and will never even know their names? Because history in Egypt wasn't just recorded, it was controlled. The scribes didn't just write events, they decided what deserved to exist. And that brings us to one of the most dangerous forms of power: control over truth. If you control history, you control reality. And Egypt understood this better than almost any civilization. Victories were exaggerated, defeats were hidden, failures were rewritten, and enemies were sometimes erased completely. So what we read today might not be the full truth. It might be the version they wanted to survive. Now let's go even deeper, because behind priests and scribes, there was another layer, a quieter one. The elite families, these were powerful bloodlines, connected to temples, administration, and the royal court. They didn't always sit on the throne, but they influenced who did. They arranged marriages, built alliances, and maintained power across generations. Pharaohs came and went, but these families stayed. Think about that. A king might rule for 20 years, but a powerful family could influence Egypt for centuries. That's long-term control. And it gets even more strategic, because sometimes the pharaoh himself was just a symbol, a face to maintain stability, while real decisions were made behind closed doors. Now this might sound extreme, but history gives us clues. Young kings, child rulers, weak leaders. How did the empire keep running smoothly? Because someone else was making the decisions. Someone experienced, someone hidden. And this pattern repeats again and again. Now let's connect this to something bigger. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, something very interesting happened. He didn't destroy the system, he became part of it. He allowed himself to be declared a pharaoh, accepted Egyptian traditions, and worked with the existing priesthood. Why? Because he understood something most conquerors didn't. You don't control Egypt by force alone. You control it by controlling its system. And that system was already built. The same thing happened later with the Romans. They didn't come in and wipe everything out. They adapted. They used the same structures, the same religious influence, the same administrative systems. Because the machine was too powerful to replace. It was easier to use it. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating figures in this entire story, Cleopatra. She is often seen as a powerful queen, a master manipulator, someone who controlled her own destiny. And yes, she was incredibly intelligent. But even she was playing within the system. She formed alliances with Roman leaders, navigated political chaos, and used every strategy she could. But in the end, the system was bigger than her. Egypt fell under Roman control, and the structure, the hidden network of power, continued under new rulers. Because remember this, systems don't die easily. They evolve, they adapt, they survive, and that's the real secret behind Egypt. It wasn't just a kingdom. It was a machine of control, refined over thousands of years. A machine where religion shaped belief, knowledge shaped truth, wealth shaped survival, and hidden figures shaped everything else. So when you ask, who secretly controlled Egypt? The answer becomes even more chilling. It wasn't just priests. It wasn't just elites. It wasn't just foreign rulers. It was all of them, working within a system designed to stay invisible. A system where power didn't need to be seen, to be absolute. And maybe the most unsettling part is this: if something was powerful enough to control one of the greatest civilizations in history, without most people even realizing it, then maybe, just maybe, the real controllers were never meant to be found.